interview of Wes Huff over on Joe Rogan. This is Tony. Hope you're all doing well. And I got some amazing stuff to present in this video. I believe there was 3 miracles that actually brought forth this entire interview in the first place. And we're going to get into that. And I think a lot of people don't even know what some of these are. First one I wanted to mention, we're actually, like I said, we're going to get into a ton of stuff. We're going to talk about what they discussed on the interview. We're going to get into details that he didn't have a chance to get into. And I'm going to show you some of the stuff backing up what he's saying. And we're going to do a little bit of a deep dive on a few of the things that he was talking about. So first I wanted to mention this. We had something that was discovered shortly before this all happened, where this interview, or not this interview, this debate technically between Billy Carson and Wes Huff, there was actually an archaeological find that happened just before this took place. And let's see if I can get on the screen. I guess that's good enough. Earliest Jesus is God inscription found, deemed greatest discovery since the Dead Sea Scrolls. This was in November 19th. And the reason why this is so important and actually leads into this whole thing, it shows that God set this entire thing up. Because this discovery shows that people believed Jesus was God even in the first century. All right? Well, technically, yeah, first century. It would have been first century. So 100 something AD, people were already saying Jesus is God, and that's what it says on this archaeological find underneath the floor of a Megiddo prison in Israel. All right? So the reason why I'm pointing this out and how this relates to this entire topic is that Billy Carson, one of his main points is that they turned Jesus into God during the time of Emperor Constantine, which was around 300 and something AD. So that right there was God saying, look, I'm setting the stage. Here's an archaeological find that proves Billy Carson, one of his main talking points, is wrong. Okay, this wasn't even brought up in this debate between Wes Huff and Billy Carson. Well, maybe it was. I didn't watch the whole thing, so maybe it did come up somewhere. I don't know. But what's really interesting is we have this clip here. This is from an interview on the channel The Next Level Soul podcast. Got 3.5 million views about Jesus and his true teachings found in the lost texts. And of course, I'm into the whole apocryphal pseudepigraphical texts. I'm into the lost text myself. I do a lot of research into this, and they don't say, well, I can't just say blanket statements here, but what Billy Carson's been presenting is not what I've been seeing. Okay, let's just put it that way. And here, let's just play this clip from this podcast and what he has to say here. This is about what I was just showing you, this archaeological find, and how Billy Carson says they basically changed, essentially made Christianity, made Jesus God during the time of Constantine.
That was the first time I'm like, oh my God, that's right, Constantine. Oh my God, that he's the one that created the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD. And they're the ones that sat down and like, okay, let's argue about what really Jesus is. And so they basically built up the mythology in the Council of Nicaea, right?
Yes. The Council of Nicaea came together, built up the mythology. They added to the story. They took from a lot of ancient texts. And
so he goes into here and he talks like he sounds very confident in what he says. He's got that dead eye look, like sort of like a poker face, and just tells you, hey, yeah, this is exactly what happened. Unfortunately, he's wrong, because again, I just showed you an archaeological find that shows they were calling Jesus God in the hundreds, like 110, 80, or whatever it was, 111, whatever it was. The exact date, we're not quite sure, but it's in that range. All right. So I thought that was really interesting. That was one miracle. Another miracle is, I think that him being healed when he was younger, he said when he was a young teen, he had actually had some sort of illness that attacked his nervous system and caused it to where it cut off communication between his brain and his lower body, is pretty much a paraplegic for 30 days. And then usually you have muscle atrophy when that occurs, but that did not happen to him. He just woke up one day and started walking. And so that indicates sort of a miracle in that respect. Usually there's a very much smaller chance of you recovering from this. I think he said 30% chance you could recover from this, but usually if you do, well, for one, you'll have muscle atrophy after 30 days, but on top of that, you may have a lot of issues walking. He has no issues whatsoever. Just got up, started walking perfectly like nothing ever happened. I would classify that as a miracle. And I think that would have led into him getting into some of the stuff in his life that caused him to go this direction. Right? So another miracle, of course, is the timing of this debate with Billy Carson. I think it's what led to this whole thing blowing up and becoming a big viral topic and leading to him getting on Joe Rogan. So that's sort of my little synopsis of what I think happened here. But what's really interesting about this, he's talking about 4 languages that are essentially isolated. He calls them, what was the word he used? Isolates. He calls these languages isolates. So they have these interesting languages: Sumerian, Linear Elamite, Akkadian, and Paleo-Hebrew, saying that these languages don't have any languages nearby that relate to them whatsoever. They're just islands. They're islands, languages that are essentially islands where there's no language that relates to them whatsoever. And this seems very curious, particularly considering all other languages seem to be related in one way or another. Why do we have these 4 languages that seem to be isolated, just coming out of nowhere, and in the case of Sumerian, disappearing? Not too much. Well, after so many years, so many hundreds of years or thousands, it disappears. Well, he says that it had to do with potentially the Tower of Babel. And this actually makes sense because, of course, that was when these languages, at least to the story, it says that all these languages were created to confuse people so they couldn't all unite to build a tower against, God or the God, Yahweh. Of course, there's many other quote unquote small gods during this time, but they were all seemingly working together. And of course, this is Nimrod. A lot of people believe this is also Gilgamesh. I've shown evidence that Gilgamesh and Nimrod are the exact same person in Sumer. And I've gotten into that topic many times before. Tower of Babel was around between basically 2800 BC and 1950 BC, according to scholars, okay? Now, what's really interesting is these languages are around that time frame as well. So you have, of course, Akkadian language, which was around the 25th century. Very interesting. Sumerian also, when it was originally written, was in the 3000s. So that's sort of in that range as well. All these languages that are sort of islands that just somehow popped up out of nowhere, have no relation to other languages, were around the same time frame, approximately. And they all seem to sort of relate to the time of the Tower of Babel as well. So I thought that was kind of interesting. That was something he mentioned. Now, another thing that was interesting is, and like I said, we're going to get into a ton of stuff in this video. I guess I should do this right now. But before we go any further, I got to mention food supply, 25-year shelf life. Link is in the description. I got to do my promotion, my friends. Link is in the description for this. You're going to definitely want to get this if you have not already. Link is in the description. $5.97 for 3 months worth of food. Check the link below. Also, this book here, The Lost Ways, How Your Great-Great-Grandfather Lived Without Electricity, How to Build a Cellar, Do Things Around the House Like They Did in the Good Old Days, hundreds of pages illustrated. You're going to definitely want to have that, considering all the wonderful things, and I'm being sarcastic, happening around us the last few years. It's always wise to be prepared. Get the printed version, because you're not going to be able to use it if you have no electricity. Get the printed version, $37 plus shipping. Link is in the description. And of course, also my website, GR Videos, is linked below. I have a lot of interesting deep dives into topics. Go check that out, link below as well. I get into all manner of stuff. Ancient history, the Vatican, strange topics in the Bible, just all manner of stuff. Also, things going on in our culture, Link is in the description for that. So let's get back to the video. So, of course, what's really interesting about this interview that Wes Huff just did, they're obviously going back and they're echoing back or talking with regards to this interview Billy Carson did on Joe Rogan back, when was this? June 4th of this year, or last year, June 4th of 2024. And he goes in here, and this is in the first 10 minutes of the interview. Billy Carson is basically saying that he can read Sumerian, which is interesting because Wes Huff, in his interview today, was saying that he tried to teach himself Sumerian and he couldn't. Again, this echoes back to what I just said a minute ago. Sumerian is an island language. It's not related to any other language. Okay, so you have these languages that popped up out of nowhere, have no relation to any other language like Linear Elamite. And this is Linear Elamite here. And this one's Sumerian. These have no relation to any other languages. So how did Billy Carson just teach himself this? I mean, is he kind of like, is he just some sort of intellectual that just can figure things like this out on his own, just out of nowhere? Seems a little difficult. I mean, unless you're Joseph Smith, right, who supposedly was able to translate Egyptian hieroglyphics, which he apparently later, when scholars did finally figure out how to translate Egyptian hieroglyphics, they saw that what he translated was incorrect. It could be the same story here. Somebody that says they know something and they don't, you know what I mean? But he says here in this interview with Joe Rogan in the first 10 minutes that he basically taught himself. He talks about a certain researcher into the ancient, aliens topic. The man's name is Sitchin. He talks about him. He says here he was one of the greatest researchers of the time, and the reason why is he laid out so much information for us to begin to scratch our head and ask questions. But what I figured out was going through the UCLA online website, digital library, say the past 10 times I was able to take stone tablets and decipher them myself. So anyone can go online to UCLA CDLI online, cuneiform digital library, and read the stone tablets for themselves. You don't need Zachary Hitchens. You don't need anyone else, and began to break these tablets down. So he claims that he figured it out all himself, right? What's interesting is Zachary Hitchens has also been debunked, and I'm going to get into that in a little while, by someone who actually is an ancient Near Eastern scholar named Dr. Michael Heiser. I'll get into that in a little bit. But let's just play this clip here. This is from another super viral video. No, this is actually the one I referenced earlier. They knew Jesus Christ's true teachings found in the lost texts. Next Level Soul podcast. Let's just play this clip here in the beginning of his video.
Thousands of years before them, an advanced race lived on this planet, built an Atlantean global civilization, probably Atlantean interplanetary civilization that had capability of space flight and everything else, and that they most likely genetically modified the existing hominids, which then became Homo sapiens sapien, in order to...
So you get kind of the idea. Kind of follows that movie Prometheus, which I've actually done videos on the movie Prometheus, and actually the character Prometheus, who may actually be the devil when you break down sort of the Greek mythology, sort of the generations of the gods. You got the primordial gods, it breaks down, and you get the Titans, you get the second generation Titans. And what's really interesting is there are actual biblical texts that talk about these beings. No one seems to know this, though. Mainly because most people just talk about the 66 books. They don't ever talk about the Apocrypha, or, well, now people do some. The Pseudepigraphia. There was actually a text called the Sibylline Oracles. And you can actually look into the Sibylline Oracles. It's actually, just like it sounds, oracle would be prophecies. I think it started around the 4th century BC until about the 2nd century AD. Several texts compiled together called the Sibylline Oracles, predicting essentially the future. And you have Pompey predicted, you have Constantine predicted. I'll show you that in a little bit. You had Jesus predicted. You even have John, who wrote Revelation, quoting from the Sibylline Oracles, which I've shown in a previous video. What's really interesting is when you start looking into these texts that surround Scripture and early church history, you look into the early, Justin Martyr, all these different people, they talk about these texts, but today, for some reason, they're off limits. And guess who gets into them? People like Billy Carson. And because no one in the church gets into these texts hardly, other than maybe Wes Huff, he does some, which I'm going to show you some of his infographics, which are really interesting. Because no one gets into it, they can't really defend anything. They can't go against these guys. What about all these weird texts that no one seems to know anything about? Because too often, a lot of these quote-unquote scholars in the church, I don't even want to call them scholars. They have PhDs. Sometimes they're honorary PhDs. Not in the case of Wes Huff. Wes Huff seems to be a legitimate scholar, legitimately knows his craft, right? But there are a lot of scholars out there, or people that say they're scholars, that, and I'm not one, by the way. I'm not. I have a mechanical engineering degree. I'm just a guy that researches myself. But there's a lot of people who claim to be scholars and are in the church and they're leading the church, telling them things, telling them never to look into these books, never look at the book of Enoch, not worth your time, don't look at any of these texts. And then while that's happening, you have people like Billy Carson coming out and saying, hey, you should look at these texts, but then he doesn't even represent them correctly. And then paints this picture of ancient aliens, the History Channel. This is what happens. And because no one looks into this stuff, other than maybe Dr. Michael Heiser, who's now, rest in peace. I think, when did he die? Last year or a year before? Here's a clip of Dr. Michael Heiser so he was invited to one of these conferences, Bay Area UFO conference, and it was all about ancient aliens. It's all about the Sitchin stuff. Basically the exact same stuff that Billy Carson always promotes, and they didn't realize he didn't believe in this stuff. He's a scholar in this area, but he doesn't believe in it. So check this out. It's pretty funny.
I was invited to speak at the Bay Area UFO conference, and I was invited to speak about ancient astronauts. I'm an ancient studies scholar. I'm a biblical scholar. This is great. He was on Coast to Coast, and that was a wonderful interview. Let's have this guy come out and do this. I wasn't vetted at all. In other words, they thought they were getting a believer. I am not.
Pause.
Okay, I got the ad already. Okay, so you got the idea. So he's not a believer in the ancient alien thing, which of course was brought forth by a man named Sitchin, which Billy Carson references. I was quoting what he was saying. I didn't play the clip from Joe Rogan because of numerous reasons. I played a clip of Joe Rogan like 7 years ago and it got hit with a copyright. And then I saw also Ruslan got hit with several copyrights for playing a Joe Rogan clip. So I'm not going to play any Joe Rogan clips. If you want to go watch it, you go watch Joe Rogan's clip. I'm just going to quote what they're saying in the text in the closed caption. I won't play that video. But my point is that, so you have this scholar named Dr. Michael Heiser who essentially didn't, and this is why I wanted to talk about this, because it's really interesting. So our world's really a mess. Honestly, the way I look at it, you have these seminaries, they teach ideological teachings, okay? Now, Dr. Michael Heiser, he didn't exactly go the route he was supposed to. You're supposed to just believe what you're taught. And the way I'm saying this is you have Lutheran seminaries, you got this type of seminary, that they're going to put their spin on it, right? They're always going to put their spin on the studies, what they think is the truth. Instead of just looking at it objectively, just sitting down as what is this saying? What do the ancient texts say? And looking at it objectively from sort of a scriptural standpoint, they don't do that, which of course, Dr. Michael Heiser started questioning some of the stuff that he was being taught, and he started to go the direction of where looking into some of these ancient pseudepigraphical texts, apocryphal texts, just wondering, is some of our theology not exactly right? Were there giants? Were there things happening in the ancient past that we're not allowed to think anymore? Stuff like this, right? So he had gotten into all this stuff, and he started studying what these ancient astronaut guys were saying, like Billy Carson. He made this website called Sitchin is Wrong. Can I get it on the screen? I can't get it on the screen, right? Okay, well, it says right at the top here, Sitchin is Wrong up here. The website is literally sitchiniswrong.com. It's a website made by Dr. Michael Heiser. He goes through, talks about Nibiru, and shows you how they just completely fabricating this ancient astronaut, story into these tablets and stuff. It doesn't actually say ancient astronauts. Is what he basically goes through it, and he's a scholar in this area and shows how it doesn't say what they're saying it says. Okay, so obviously this doesn't, if you're into sci-fi and stuff, like, oh, that's a real letdown. People want to just believe what they want to believe. The fact is, it doesn't say that stuff, that even though it's been perpetuated everywhere, and it's perpetuated on the History Channel endlessly for probably over a decade now, with no one really standing up to him. I mean, there are people standing up to him, but no one really with a big voice standing up to him, right? So that's why a lot of people are so excited to see Wes Huff on the show. That's the entire point. But so, Adder, you get the idea. So getting on to some of these other things, I want to get into a lot of stuff. What is this one about? Okay. I want to play that. I can't play that. All right. So what am I going to do now? All right. So we have here. Okay. So yeah, there's an interesting clip here. Let me show you this. So in this clip here, and I can't play it, unfortunately, because I don't want to get some copyright goofy stuff. He talks about the Hebrew vowel points being added in to the Hebrew scriptures back in the Middle Ages. Okay. By the Masoretes. This is something I was talking about 15 years ago on YouTube, believe it or not. Actually, well, it wasn't 15. It was 13 years ago. 13 years ago, I was talking about this stuff on YouTube, and people thought I was crazy when I was talking about it. But here he is talking about the exact same thing. And you see his face there. You see how he's got kind of like, he's usually got a stone face, but he's kind of got a little bit of a smirk there. He's pointing out how they actually, he says here, let me just read what he says. Like, look at the Hebrew Bible today. You see that these vowels, and sometimes like the introduction of a vowel, is significant in changing the words. And then he makes this face because, and he doesn't say more really, but this is something I was talking about for like 13 years ago on YouTube, that they put a commentary in the Hebrew Bible with these vowel points. And he's basically alluding to that with this sort of comment he made here at the 49-minute and 30-second mark of the interview that it just came out today on Joe Rogan. And here's an example. This is something I read in the Adam Clark commentary. The vowel point system is actually a running commentary which was incorporated into the text itself. Why would they do that? Well, Masoretes are not believers in Yeshua, and there are texts in the Old Testament that point to the Messiah being him, like Psalm 91, and then they put Hebrew vowel points in it. So instead of it saying his hands were pierced, it will say it's a lion. Because when I say vowel, so if you don't understand what I'm getting at, so in the Hebrew language, in the ancient Hebrew, it had no vowels. So like if you can imagine English without vowels, like, so the word vowel would be VWL. You would have the O and E missing, right? So you would be reading it with literally, if you could imagine a book written in English with 0 vowels, you would have to guess what the vowels are when you're reading it, right? So imagine something happens in history that you don't like, but technically it's the truth and you just don't like it. So then you have a text pointing to that thing you don't like, but then you can add these vowel points in to make it so it says something different and doesn't point to them anymore. You see what I mean? That's what happened. And I was pointing that out 13 years ago here on YouTube. He was basically kind of hinting at it there in the interview at the 49-minute mark. And this is really important stuff. A lot of people don't understand any of this stuff. And then you get people like Billy Carson, who actually doesn't know what he's talking about, going out there and telling you all these things about ancient aliens and that Jesus was made into a god at the time of Constantine, when in reality, that's not the case. We even have archaeological find that just came out, which shows you God's interest in this topic, because there's always something like this. I've seen this pattern before many times where something important comes up and there'll be an archaeological find just before it happens. And this is just the latest one. I've shown this over the last couple of years. There's been other archaeological finds. There was a Zechariah find, Zechariah scroll find. What was that, a couple of years ago? Let me see if I can find that. And it actually said something really interesting too. I don't want to get into that. It would be another whole video. Scroll, find, what was that? No, archeological, dude. Not, yeah, here we go. Was it Zechariah? Yeah, here it is. Okay, it was 2021. I was wrong. I was thinking 2022. They found fragments of the skull of Zechariah, and the part of the scroll they found was a story that was literally represented in the archaeological find. They found a ephah, or a like jar, and they found a woman next to the jar, and then they found the scroll of Zechariah, and in the scroll of Zechariah there's actually a story about a woman in an ephah, or a jar. And it's like whoa, that's crazy. So that was like one thing that happened back in 2021. So there's always the weird things like this that happen. I just thought that was interesting though. But let's getting on to some other stuff here. So we're going to get into a lot of stuff actually. He goes into it and he shows in his infographics on his website. Here he's got the first English Bibles. Now, I've said in the past the Tyndale is the first version, English version. Actually, it's the first English version from Greek and Hebrew. The first English version is the Wycliffe, and it was translated from the Latin Vulgate, which the Latin Vulgate, I don't trust. It was translated by Jerome. Jerome has a lot of issues, I don't want to get into, that'd be a whole nother video, but I am not a fan of Jerome. I'm not a fan of Augustine either, but I know a lot of people that probably watch me are a fan of Augustine, but I'm not a fan of either of those guys. Jerome translated the Latin Vulgate. Here's a fun fact. Lucifer, the word Lucifer that we call the devil, that was actually a common name during that time. During the time of Jerome, Lucifer was a very common name. And there was a bishop named Bishop Lucifer. He was a good guy. He was a bishop named Lucifer. And he was his arch enemy. And so go figure, he would name the devil Lucifer in the Latin Vulgate when his arch enemy bishop is named Bishop Lucifer. Does that make, you see what I'm getting at? So that just shows you a little bit of who Jerome is, just to give you an idea. But at any rate, so I've pointed out in the past how I actually have some of these Bibles. Like he shows here the Great Bible. Let's see if I can get it on the screen. I can't even get this on the screen right. There we go. The Great Bible. If I can get my mouse on the screen. Great Bible right there. The Tyndale. The Matthew Bible. I actually have the Matthew one right behind me. Right here's the Matthew Bible. I have the Tyndale around here somewhere. I think it's up on this shelf somewhere too. Obviously everybody has the King James version. I don't have the Wycliffe though. I don't have the Wycliffe. That's an interesting one though. But I'm sort of a collector of some of these things as well. What's really interesting, I wanted to show a passage that I think most Bibles have mistranslated. I'm going to just go on a limb in here and say this. And it's an interesting one too, because there's a lot of people that hinge their theology on this one verse, which is mistranslated, I believe. And I'll show it too. So I'm going to show you the Wycliffe version. I'm going to show you the Tyndale version. Let me show you the Tyndale version first. It's going to surprise some of you maybe. It's a verse, Matthew 5:27-28. I've talked about it numerous times on this channel. It has to do with desiring or lusting, of course, after a woman. If you've done this, you've committed adultery, right? You've probably heard this before. Notice how it's translated in the William Tyndale version, the first English translation from the actual Greek and Hebrew, around 1527, I think it was. But I say unto you, whosoever eyeth a wife, not a woman, a wife, desiring her, hath committed adultery, see the word spelled differently back then, in his heart. Now let me go to the Wycliffe. The Wycliffe does say woman, but it says something different too. This is why I love these old translations, because they give you a little bit better context. But okay, you've heard that it is said of old men, thou shalt not do lechery. But I say to you, every man that seeth a woman to covet her. Oh, that's interesting. The word covet. That's very interesting if you think about it. And I'll show you why it's so interesting in a minute. Instead of the word lust, hath now done lechery. So the word covet, I think, is actually the best one. The reason why is because of what I think Jesus is quoting. I think he's paraphrasing the 10th commandment of Exodus 20. And here's sort of the evidence of that in one of my articles. Guneka, this is the word for wife in Greek. The word gun is usually the word for woman. almost every time this word is guneka in the Greek, it's almost every single time. Just go through the scriptures and look up guneka and see what it is. Virtually every verse, it's wife. For some reason, this one verse, they decided to translate woman in almost every modern version of the Bible. Why would they do that? That's a good question. Perhaps it's wrong. So you even have ancient commentators talking about this, like Theophilos of Antioch, showing that he even puts context. He adds a word in Greek that means belongeth to another to make it very clear it's not just any woman. And the fact that it uses the same word for covet in both the 10th commandment, do not covet thy neighbor's wife, and the one he quoted, makes it more clear that it is correct. And actually, knowing it's the Sermon on the Mount where he says, I have not come to change the law, it would make sense he would be quoting the law, right? So he was saying, do not covet thy neighbor's wife. That's all he was saying. He was saying, but if you've done it in your heart, you've already done the sin. That's what he was saying. He wasn't saying anything new. Unfortunately, they've translated this incorrectly. This is why it's so important to look at these ancient commentaries and ancient translation, or not ancient, translations from 500 years ago. That's why it's wise to look into the ancient languages and stuff as well. You also have, of course, he also has this graph of the apostolic fathers and the Greek fathers, Latin fathers. And this is a really interesting topic to look into as well, because a lot of these fathers, you don't really see their writings whatsoever. And a lot of these sort of veins of theology were cut off. A lot of people are not aware of this. I'm trying to get this on the screen where I can see it better, or you can see it better. It's really kind of a pain. So, of course, the Latin fathers, that's the side that seemed to be the most promoted in the church in the end. You have, of course, Tertullian, Cyprian, you have here Ambrose, and you get over here and you get into Jerome and Augustine of Hippo. I don't even think it doesn't show it on the screen. Right underneath Jerome, it says Augustine. I'm trying to get this to show on the screen better. I don't know. I got like a million windows, but I don't know if any of these will show it right. Not really. Oh, here we go. This one does. Okay, so you can see here Jerome and Augustine of Hippo are in the Latin Father category. And there was actually 5 schools of theology in the early church, and pretty much only one in the end got the biggest voice, and that would be the Latin North African School of Theology. However, and that's what's commonly taught in almost every church that's Catholic and Protestant, is the Latin School of Theology. On the Orthodox side, you might get some of these Greek fathers. You'll get some of the, within the Orthodox Church, you'll get some of the apostolic Greek fathers and things of this nature. What's really interesting is, like Clement of Alexandria, Origen of Alexandria, you won't see much of their writings anywhere. And Origen, of course, was deemed a heretic 300 years after, I think it was 302 or 300 years after he was dead. He was considered one of the greatest theologians of his time, rivaling Augustine for contribution to the faith in our ideas and thoughts within the faith. Yet, for some reason, 200-300 years after he was dead, heretic. Very interesting. And of course, it probably didn't help too much that his followers were kind of off in a wacky way. So I think it probably was his followers that basically contributed to the problem, because they kind of went off in their own direction a little bit, kind of in a weird direction with, I'm trying to remember the right term, but it has to do with the afterlife, and it has to do with, like, not reincarnation, but they had some weird thing. I can't remember exactly what it was, but it was some weird stuff that they got into. Origen, though, wasn't, I think it was kind of like Origen was like kind of pushing the boundaries of where your ideas could go. And then maybe some of his followers kind of pushed through too far. And maybe that's what ended up happening. I don't know. But I think it's interesting, though. He kind of reminds me of Nikola Tesla in the faith. Like, he had a lot of really interesting ideas, but now he's taboo. Don't ever look at his stuff. Matter of fact, a lot of his writings were gone. I think they were basically burned or something, a lot of them. So you can there's still some of his stuff left you can go check out, though. But it is interesting, though. A lot of our ideas come from Augustine, and I'm not a fan of Augustine, and that'll be another video I get into that. But I think Jerome was way worse than Augustine, but Augustine had his issues. Let's just put it that way. I think he brought in some ideas that were not good, that kind of caused what you see today. I think a lot of our weird cultural problems, the huge division in our culture, I think is, believe it or not, I think a lot of it's because of Augustine's ideas. That's my theory. But it's just playing out in the modern day. That's, like I said, I'll get into that in another video though. But getting over to this whole podcast with Wes Huff on Joe Rogan again, I'm trying to remember what this one was about here. Okay, so this is 1 hour and 52 minutes in. Okay, let me go find out what this was about, because I didn't have it on. Oh, there it goes. Wait, no, the closed caption. Let me see. Let me get the closed caption in the right place real quick, because I think there was something really important he says here. Why is it not up? Here we go. This is what happens when you have a very long podcast. It's hard to find stuff. Okay, let's see. What was he saying here that was so important that I liked? Oh yeah, he's talking about evolution and Genesis and stuff. Okay, so he's not obviously a scientist in that respect. So he's just saying, you know, you should defer it to people that are scientists in this area. But he does see an issue with evolution, macroevolution. I used to talk about this topic a lot back on YouTube in the old days. But I was going to talk about something interesting I found in the apocryphal text, which a lot of people don't know about, is that there's a lot of indication in the apocryphal text that there were these days of creation were 1,000 years long. And the reason why I say that, and you can see this in the book of Adam and Eve, it says, in this day ye shall die to Adam. But Adam lived to, what was it, 990 something? Apparently he lived till 930. But if you look at the book of Adam and Eve, in this day ye shall die, it was referring to within 1,000 years, because it says 1 day equals 1,000 years. That's a very common theme also in the apocryphal literature. I've shown it before on numerous videos. If you follow my videos, I've shown where it talks about there being a 6,000 year period, and then the day of rest, which is the millennial kingdom. And then after that, a short time the devil's let out. I don't want to get into that whole topic right now, but there's also, before Adam, there was thousands of years as well. I believe each one of those days was 1,000 years. We don't know what day the angels were made on. Aliens. The angels were made on, which of course I do think aliens are probably likely devils or whatever, but that's another topic as well. Well, technically it kind of fits into this, but there was thousands of years before Adam is what I'm saying. And actually Adam might have been in the garden for even 1,000 years before he got tempted and Eve got tempted. We don't know exactly how that worked. That's a little complicated as well. But I do believe each day of creation was probably 1,000 years in length, based according on the Apocrypha. I'm not saying this is scientific. I'm not saying this is some common viewpoint. I'm just saying what the Apocryphal literature, numerous texts seem to say, and I'm not going to show them all here because it would take me a long time to show all this stuff. But it is interesting that the book of Adam and Eve said that in this day you shall die, but he lived till 930. And then it even talks before he was reached 1,000, he was dying, because of that statement that was made. So interestingly, like I mentioned, there's this book I just recently learned about called the Sibylline Oracles. Again, this is a book that existed during the intertestamental period, but it also existed before that. It was in the 4th century BC even, up into the 2nd century AD. And it has all these predictions in it. It predicts, there's a prediction of Jesus' birth in this Sibylline Oracles. I've shown it in a previous video. There's a prophecy of Emperor Constantine. And I got into this and I showed how in this prediction, there's a statement that was quoted in Revelation even. Can we get this on the screen right? This is not going to show the bottom of it. Is this the one? Sorry. Yeah, here it is. Okay, here it is. So this was actually, I think, quoted in Revelation by John right here. This is talking about the Antichrist. He will delude many by the I can't read. He will delude many by the magic art so that fire will seem to come down from heaven. You remember it says in Revelation that he'll make it so fire comes down from heaven, right? That, I believe, was quoted by John from the Sibylline Oracles, and it was a prophecy also of Emperor Constans. Now, Constans is actually the son of Constantine, but I don't know if this is referring to Constantine or Constans. I don't know which one it's referring to. Either one probably would qualify anyways. And it talks about there will arise a king of the Greeks whose name is Constans. He will be king of the Romans and Greeks. He will be of tall stature, handsome appearance, shining face, well put together. After this, he will come to Jerusalem, having put off the diadem from his head, laid aside the whole imperial garb. He will hand over the empire of the Christians to the God, Father, and Jesus Christ, his Son. So it's very interesting. Who is the first Roman emperor to give over the kingdom to the Trinity? Oh, that would be Constantine, wouldn't it? This was written well before then. This was written, I think, in the early, like right before AD, like sort of like, I think around 30 BC. I kind of I figured it out from doing some research before this. Now, also what's interesting, the Sibylline oracles predict Pompey's demise. It predicts a number of other things as well. There's actually a lot of things predicted in it. Now, of course, again, dealing with historians and scholars, and this is the issue I have with historians and scholars, sometimes particularly modern ones, is they pick and choose what they want to believe. They have a separation. And I'm not talking about Wes Huff. I'm talking about historians and those that are in some of the craft, like dating things. Like, for example, dating the Gospel of Mark or something. They'll date it to, I'm trying to remember what they date it to. And this is just off the top of my head. Gospel of Mark, when was it written? Here we go. It'll say something like this, 6570 CE, right? It'll tell you that, right? Or AD. So the problem with this is Mark, okay, so if just using the AI alone, you'll show the reason why this is ridiculous. So let me type in, how old was Mark when he wrote his gospel? Late teens to early 20s. Okay. Now, when was Jesus born? Around 3 BC. So he'd have been about 30 years old. He started his ministry. Mark would be in his 20s, probably. So what is that? So you got 30 minus 70, that's 40 years. So 40 years plus 20 is 60 years old. How old did people live in Jesus' time? 30, 35 years. So he would have already been long dead. That's 25 years after he's dead, probably. So these scholars will tell you it was written in 6570 AD, but that actually doesn't make logical sense if you just use your intuition and think about it a little bit. It's like, the reason why they say this, though, is because, well, we got archaeological finds that kind of put it in that time frame. No, what you have is archaeological finds of copies that were in that time frame, and that's not actually when it was written. So they don't actually tell you when it was written. They just tell you when their latest scientific archaeological find was. They don't think about, does this make common sense? So they do this also with the Book of Enoch. Oh, it was written in the intertestamental period. No, that's the last time you've seen an ancient archaeological evidence that relates to the Book of Enoch. No, it probably wasn't written then. It was probably written thousands of years before then. You should have to look at historical quotes in other texts to kind of maybe gauge it back farther. But they don't want to do that. They want to do science, you know. I mean, archaeological, but it's just, there's a lot of irony to this. Because, of course, when it comes to the science side with evolution and stuff, they automatically just add millions of years. So this is all just simply in their heads. This is not actual evidence. So like they'll use the geologic column, which was literally invented by someone, which is not even accurate in most parts of the world. When you look at the layers of the earth, it's accurate, generally speaking, in many places, but not everywhere. Okay. It's actually, from what I understand, it's inaccurate maybe 40% of the time or more. So they have this geological column, which is basically inaccurate. They don't even know how these layers got to be the way they are, because they're different materials. I'm a mechanical engineer. I know about things like hydrologic sorting. I know about specific weights of materials that when you sort them in water, different weights go at different heights, and that would explain why each layer has a different rock in it scientifically, but they ignore that. And they just say, no, millions of years. Instead of Noah's flood, that could explain the different layers via hydrologic sorting via specific weight, which is something very simple you learn when you're doing science classes. You see what I mean? So it's all what they think and believe being put onto the scientific evidence and not what it actually is. This is my point with all this. So at any rate, I think you get kind of the idea. But what's really interesting, I'm going to show you another Sibylline oracle that has to do with Jesus. This is kind of interesting. But first, let me just play this clip from Dr. Michael Heiser. This is kind of interesting.
I have great confidence in the average Christian's ability to understand Scripture. I think pastors regularly underestimate the intelligence of the person in the pew. It really gripes me that sermon content is so dumbed down. I think it's insulting to many people in the pew.
Give us an example of that.
Just, basically anywhere, how no matter where you're preaching, the passage becomes about salvation, tithing, baptism, all the basics of the Christian life. Oh, raising your kids, let's throw that.
Yeah, so they basically just do it on everyday living. They don't do it on getting anywhere into the deep understandings or meanings of Scripture. It's just about everyday living, and they're just trying to make verses, relate to your life. Or you're going to work 9 to 5, and you got a family. It's like that or something, right? So it's not about, is there some oracles from thousands of years ago predicting the Messiah and on top of the Scripture itself in the Old Testament? Yeah, there is actually. There is actually. That's why there were magi that came from another planet, from Egypt to go see him. And magi means magician. It doesn't mean like magi, some made up word. It means nothing. It means literally magician. So at any rate, there were astrologers that actually they weren't the type that you see today. A little bit different, okay? Maybe they knew a different understanding of how to read what was in the stars. Because, and I've covered this before as well. If you take what is that software called for stars? Sturium? Is that Sturium? Is that how you call it? Stellarium. That's how you call it. If you use Stellarium and you go back to 3 BC, September, on, we'll say the 11th day. That's a kind of interesting day, wouldn't it? September? Yeah, actually it is. That's the day when all these stars align. Wandering stars, not these stars. The wandering stars align on that day. You get the Revelation 12, of course, sign in the stars on that day. It's literally the text of Revelation 12. You can go read it. In the stars. And you have the planets aligning on his birth. And you can see it in Stellarium. That was the day he was born on. That's kind of interesting. Why does no one know that? Well, it wasn't December 25th. It wasn't when Santa Claus comes, okay? But that's what they tell you. So that's something interesting. Now, let's get into this here. You have Micah 5:2. But you, Bethlehem, though you're small among the clans of Judah, out of you come one who will be ruler over Israel, whose origins are from ancient times. Now, this is from the Sibylline oracles, whose hands were stretched out on the fruitful wood, the noblest of Hebrews, who once caused the sun to stand still when he gave command with admirable speech and hollow lips. I thought this was interesting. I'm like, okay, who made the sun stand still? Joshua. Did you know the word Jesus and Joshua are the same word? Is it saying someone with the same name as Joshua, which is the word Jesus, when you actually translate it from the original languages, would have his hands outstretched on a tree? You see that? And it also echoes back to Moses with his staff that had a branch come out of it, right? Right? And we are the branch that was grafted in to the original root of Jesse, the Gentiles, right? So here you have Joshua made the sun stand still. Actually, the sun went dark for 3 hours during the crucifixion. That's kind of an interesting thing, but it doesn't exactly relate. A shoot will come up from the stump of Jesse. From his roots, a branch will bear fruit. Out of the stump of David's family will grow a shoot. Yes, a new branch bearing fruit from the old root. The Old Testament to the New, referring to the King of Kings being born. The Spirit of the Lord will rest upon him. Spirit of understanding and counsel, strength, and knowledge, and fear of the Lord. You see that? Behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord. I'll raise up for David a righteous branch, and he will reign wisely as a king, and will administer justice and righteousness in the land. This is the record of genealogy of Jesus, son of David. These are all related. You see how the pattern goes there. And it says a fruitful branch in the Sibylline oracles. Hands stretched out on it. It's completely symbolic. It's very interesting. He has the same name as Joshua in ancient Hebrew. Jesus. That is the exact same name. Admirable speech and hollowed lips. So I do believe that is indeed a prophecy that almost no one's ever heard before. Did Paul quote pagan philosophers? Yes, he did. Many times. A lot of people don't know this either. I actually have this commentary on my website, James Fawcett Brown. First half of the fifth line, word for word, astronomical poem of Arrhenius, a Greek countryman of the apostle. So you have a lot of different people that are quoted. You have Aristotle, Socrates, a lot of people quoted. So one of them, a prophet of their own, said, Cretans are always liars, evil beasts, lazy gluttons. How do you say this? Epimenides? I don't know how to say his name. Or Gnosis? I don't know how to say his name in Crete. At any rate, so there's a lot of people that are quoted by Paul. He's very much into philosophy. A lot of people are not aware of this. Aristotle, against such there is no law. This is similar to Aristotle's statement, against such there is no law. There's a quote. We found another quote, but then it disappeared. The AI found it at first, but then it lost it. And it had to do with one of Paul's quote, God of this eon, or God of this age. It was and in the way it was written, it was the exact same word for word, except for one word was changed, and it was an Aristotle quote. I can't remember what it was though. Paul says, "Know ye not, they that which run in the race run all, but one receiveth the prize." This is similar to Plato's statement, but such as are true racers arriving at the end, both receive the prizes and are crowned. So there's a lot of things. There's even apocryphal texts that are quoted all throughout Scripture. Jesus quotes the book of Enoch. There's a lot of these things. He calls himself the Son of Man. About the only book that calls him the Son of Man is Daniel, one time, or the book of Enoch. I think hundreds of times mentions the phrase Son of Man. And so I think this is all interesting stuff. You have, of course, also in the Sibylline oracles, it talks about these titans by name. It talks about Gaia, the primordial god, Gaia, the spirit of earth. Now, people think the earth doesn't have a spirit. What if it does? What if it does? Now, think about this. Not something you worship, obviously, but it says in Genesis, the blood crieth from the ground. When Abel, Cain, what he did to Abel, the blood crieth from the ground. The earth crieth. Is it the earth crieth out? I can't remember how it said it. Trying to remember. I can't type this in front of me. Earth crieth out. Scripture. Here we go. Maybe there's a lot of verses that say this. Here we go. Yeah. Your brother's blood is crying out to me from the ground. The earth is personified as opening its mouth and receiving it. See that? So a lot of people just look at that as whatever. It's just some weird fancy talk. But actually, if you look at these Sibylline oracles, it names these, and actually Scripture does itself. When you look at, you cannot serve God or mammon. Mammon doesn't mean money. Mammon is a false god of money. It's not money. It's a false god. So a lot of the Scripture has been demytholized, where they just remove this. Like, it will literally say a false god's name, and they'll just remove it and just say money instead. Like, they do this in a lot of places in Scripture. A lot of people are not aware of this. And this demytholization of Scripture is what's caused all these problems today. And a lot of this comes back to the time of Augustine. In that sort of realm is when they started saying, well, were there really giants? Well, no, they were just the sons of Cain. They started rationalizing away all these things that were told for, and you can look in ancient history books and see all the stuff talked about, that there were giants and stuff. You can even look in the medieval times. There were history books from the Spanish conquistadors when they went to the South America, and they were telling stories from the Mayans and Aztecs to them about giants, and they would see these giant skeletons. And there was even a cave in one of these texts where it talks about giant skeletons on three of them on a throne, or 3 thrones in a cave. And actually, just to show you some evidence of this, here we go. So let me show you one example. Here you got, and there shall be, and this is again in the Sibylline oracles, and there shall be, let's see if I can get on the screen a little bit better. Let me do that real quick. Okay, here we go. And there shall be for Phrygia fearful wrath, and I believe this is one of these gods. Rhea is another one. Mother of Zeus. Rhea, I believe, is one of the primordial gods, right? Mother of Zeus. And continuing along, the sea shall overflow the centaur race. You've heard of centaurs in Greek mythology, right? See how all this is here? You even have this Titan god named Eridanus. Eridanus is a Greek Titan river god, the son of Oceanus and Theus. How do you say it? Theus? At any rate, all of these Greek genealogies of these gods, quote unquote gods, are actually in the Sibylline oracles as well, and are talked about as actual beings. Now, maybe these stories in the Greek myths aren't fully, I don't know quite what to say about all that, but these beings are referenced in these pseudepigraphical, apocryphal type literature that also has prophecies of things that did occur, like the Pompeii destruction and Jesus being born and Constantine and all these other ones. And you even have, like I said, Apostle John quoting Revelation, some of the Constantine prophecy about fire being called down from heaven. And actually that gets into my other video where I talk about how I actually believe, I don't want to get into all that here, but I get into the timeline and how they actually changed the timeline that we use currently is AM3, which is not the same as the original AM1, although like if you look in the Greek Septuagint, they used AM1. If you look at Flavius Josephus, historian, used AM1. Like 2,000 years ago, they all used that. I don't want to get into all that here. At any rate, kind of want to know what some of you guys think. Let me know in the comment section below, and thanks for watching.